We've now had Nintendo Switch 2 editions announced for Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Animal Crossing New Horizon, and Kirby in the Forgotten Land. Basically, a who's who of the biggest franchises of the Nintendo Switch era. Surely, many are saying, this means that a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is on the cards. Well, let's talk about it. First of all, let's acknowledge that whereas with most of Nintendo's franchises, where they really have carte blanche over their strategies, there are a few exceptions, and Smash is definitely one. Sure, with Pokemon and Kirby, they need to liaise with the Pokemon Company and HAL, but they still have a pretty big advantage in terms of those discussions. However, the very big one is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. They definitely have to take into account about a squillion different third parties who all have a finger in the Smash pie, which makes reopening Ultimate not just likely to be hugely time-consuming, but also vastly expensive to even consider. But also, there is director Masahiro Sakurai. Now, legally, they don't need to consult Sakurai, but given that he is a hugely respected figure with his own massive independent profile, it would be not just hugely disrespectful, but also reputational suicide for Nintendo to try to ride roughshod over Sakurai's own views. We have actually been in this situation before, where a backward compatible new system aspires to have a new Smash game on the shelf, and it wasn't the best managed situation ever. Coming out of the GameCube era, Satoru Iwata had hopes for a new version on the new system, but his approach was not, shall we say, the most consultative. Here, in his own words from a prior Iwata Asks, is what happened. He said, E3 is an international gaming event, and I myself was at the E3 in May of 2005 to give a presentation about the Wii console. At the time, Wii was still being referred to by its codename Revolution, and Nintendo revealed the exterior design of this new gaming console, as well as the fact that it would include Wi-Fi support. Before the presentation, we polled a large number of people on what Nintendo titles they hoped to see made available for network play, and many put Smash Bros. At the top of their list. All the employees from Nintendo of America that were involved with E3 at the time strongly wanted to announce a new Super Smash Bros. That would be compatible with Wi-Fi play. But at the time, we still hadn't discussed this thoroughly with HAL Laboratory yet, which shared the rights to Smash Bros. With Nintendo, and we hadn't even begun planning out the production process. So I announced this subject, emphasizing that I was hoping that a Smash Bros. Game would be released as a Wi-Fi compatible title. However, most people from Japan that were in the conference room took this as an official announcement that Nintendo was going to release a new Smash Bros. Looking back at it now, I do regret the way I said this. You can't blame them for interpreting it that way. End quote. At the time, Sakurai was cornered with the quote, despite the fact that he had no idea about the announcement and no prior warning that this would happen. Iwata had a backup plan, which he also explained. I had considered what I would do if you turned me down and decided I would need to take the existing Smash Bros. Title, Super Smash Bros. Melee for Nintendo GameCube, and try to make it Wi-Fi capable while preserving as much balanced gameplay as possible in the event you, that being Sakurai, didn't want to get involved. Maybe it's more appropriate to say that I realised we wouldn't be able to add in any new elements of the game without your help, and I think I said as much when we discussed it at the hotel. It wasn't right, but you might even say I used it as a threat of sorts. End quote. I think it's safe to say that things are very different now, and that the top brass at Nintendo, Furukawa, Takahashi, and Koizumi, would be very reluctant to even be remotely seen as acting in this high-handed way towards Masahiro Sakurai, who has a huge profile and is personally identified with one of their biggest franchises as well as many other hit games. Anything that is done will be in consultation with Sakurai, and that means the first question that we need to answer when considering a possible Smash Nintendo Switch 2 edition is, what does Sakurai want? He's been fairly open about the fact that if there is more Smash, he would like to be part of it, and he's never closed the door on a new game. I think we should assume, therefore, that there will be a new original title. However, we also know some other things. First, we know that Kirby Air Riders will have a Day 1 update, suggesting that it's not a game that has been on the shelf for months, but that he is using every moment until the release to finalize it. This means that in the most optimistic scenario, work on an original Smash wouldn't start until effectively the new year, give or take a few weeks. We also know that Kirby Air Riders is not receiving DLC, suggesting that they want Sakurai to move fairly quickly on. We further know that Air Riders itself took about 3.5 years to develop, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate around 3, but building extensively on what went before with the Smash game for the Wii U, and everybody would like to see Masahiro Sakurai mitigating his frenetic pace as he goes on in the interests of his own health. I think we should be realistic that the next Smash will not be on the slate until at the earliest 2028, but more likely 2029 or 2030. That is a long window of time not to have a Switch 2 compatible Smash game, and that's why even if Sakurai might normally frown at redoing old content, there may be a logic to a Nintendo Switch 2 edition to bridge the gap. But would a new version ever be in his mind to do? He once said a DLC. These days, the DLC scam has become quite the epidemic, charging customers extra money to complete what was essentially an unfinished product. However, this was in the context that with Smash they authentically started the DLC after the game was complete and delivered. He also confirmed as far back as the Kazuya DLC Direct that the final Smash Fighter would be his last DLC for Smash Ultimate, although, of course, at the time he was recording, he wouldn't have been anticipating Nintendo's plans with the Nintendo Switch 2 editions, and it's possible that a Nintendo Switch 2 edition wouldn't be classed in quite the same way as DLC by Nintendo, or possibly not even in Sakurai's own mind. All of this means that it's by no means certain that Sakurai would greenlight a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of the game, but there are also plausible reasons why he might see this as different from the previous cases and give it the go-ahead. However, there are far more logistical issues for Nintendo than just Sakurai's own personal feelings. Firstly, we have an effective price cap of $80. While Nintendo has developed a reputation over the recent months for being pretty thick-skinned against complaints over pricing, I don't think they will want to be seen as pushing the ceiling of game prices any higher for quite some time. Now, with the base Smash Ultimate game at $60, that means that the leeway is about $20 worth of content, which is less than either of the past two DLC packs. Given the way Nintendo seem to be pricing these upgrades, they might be reluctant to include too much more than a graphical update, game chat features, and maybe mouse mode for certain sections. All things that would be appealing, but judging from the Animal Crossing New Horizons precedent, that alone would be about $5 or max $10 worth of content. I'm sure Sakurai himself would want to add a lot, but realistically, if his budget is proportionate to a $10 or $15 game, then it doesn't really suggest that he would have a lot of room to play with. Yes, Nintendo want to please Sakurai, but they will also be looking at their budgets very closely and trying to maximize bang for their buck. In other words, I think it almost has to be a fairly time-bound upgrade, not something that takes months or even years to deliver. There is also an opportunity cost as well. Every day that Sakurai is spending on revising the current title is a day that he is not spending on the next one, and while visual updates would be great and would probably be well received, Sakurai's famous perfectionism would probably make him reluctant to focus too much on a new project without supervising closely the ultimate upgrade. If there's a time window when this could possibly happen, it would almost certainly be at the end of the year. And there is a possibility. It will take some time to develop and pitch a new title, especially if the new title is something of a departure from previous titles in the series in some key way, which seems almost inevitable after how comprehensive Ultimate was in terms of representing the kind of Smash experience that we've had for many years until now. If Sakurai takes until, let's say, March to develop this plan, make some tests, hold discussions with Takahashi and Koizumi at Nintendo, and generally get his ducks in a row to secure a budget and go into development early in the next fiscal year, then he would have a window of time to play with, which could be used to make a Super Smash Bros. Ultimate upgrade. Something that will be ideally placed for a release perhaps towards the middle of next year, as long as there aren't delays due to legal issues. What would such a game include then? Well, there are three different precedents. Firstly, we have the Odyssey option, visual changes only. I think this is plausible, except that there probably are times when mouse mode could be useful, and we know that Sakurai has an interest in these sorts of things, as he once exhorted Nintendo to create a console with a scroll wheel in the controller. Therefore, if he wanted mouse mode and a few other bits and pieces as well, they could aim for a $10 price. I'm sure Nintendo will very much want game chat to be incorporated into the game. Now, the obvious thing Nintendo might want to do is to tie in characters from some of its recent games. Perhaps we get some spirits from Tri for Echoes of Wisdom, Emio from Famicom Detective Club, and so on. Just a little bit extra to add the sense that this is more than just a graphical upgrade and justify the $10. These would be elegant ways to shout out some of their more recent games, but probably wouldn't take all that long. On the other hand, if they go the full $20, we could expect some significant expansion, but I'm not sure I can think of something that Sakurai could pull off at this budget and scale that would satisfy him and the consumer, though that's not to say he couldn't think of something, of course. There was evidently something he left on the table for Ultimate, as he recounted to The Verge previously. We envision the final product and aim for that as we work on the game, so where we landed is certainly not too far from that initial vision. Even so, I feel that there are still some shortcomings which I took as lessons learned. I have a feeling the notion of being proud of differs between Japanese and English, but I do not wish to boast about what we have accomplished with this project." End quote. Lessons learned does not necessarily mean that he's gearing up to go all George Lucas on his own masterwork, but it's not impossible that a Nintendo Switch 2 edition could give him a chance to tidy up the edges. There is another option, I guess, and that would be just to institute another set of fighters passes on top of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, with the Nintendo Switch 2 edition just opening the floodgates, but I can't really see this happening. Sakurai has mentioned before, a game should be 100% done at the time of release, and I would be livid if it was split up and sold in pieces. Now, while Ultimate was done, if the Nintendo Switch 2 edition were just designed to open up a raft of new DLC, I think he might find it distasteful for the same reasons. It's essentially just continuing to add on to a game that he considers to have been finished. So, does that rule out Super Smash Bros. Ultimate getting a Nintendo Switch 2 edition? Well, no. It's too obvious a move to ignore, and I'm sure Sakurai would want the game to be playable in its best possible form, including with the best graphics. From Nintendo's point of view, they're going to really want to include game chat with Smash, given that it's the type of game where reactions are important, but this in itself is likely to pose all sorts of problems, as real estate on Sakurai's screens are at a premium, and is unlikely to want videos of people's heads floating above his fighters. This in itself may take some real consideration, and to justify the time expenditure, it may be necessary to add more spirits and some extra challenges or modes so that they can claim the $20 price point. But with most of this conversation so far, I haven't discussed the big elephant in the room, which is the legal costs of trying to get these characters ticked off for what is essentially a new version of the game. It's not impossible, of course, but it would be time-consuming and expensive, and it would mean that Sakurai would constantly be splitting his attention from whatever his next project is. I've assumed that summer would be a fair delivery date from Sakurai's point of view, but Nintendo might require longer to dot every I and cross every T, and that could prove a constant drag on Samurai and Bandai Namco's attention, and indeed it could mean that the Smash Switch 2 edition could slip later into next year or even into 2027 if things become particularly difficult. So, let's talk likelihoods. At this point, will Super Smash Bros. Ultimate receive any kind of revision for the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware? I would say it's 70% likely that it will, even if just in the form of an Odyssey-style free graphical uplift and possibly an implementation of mouse mode. If this is purely a compatibility issue, it might be contractually less thorny than an actual new edition. Why was it not released earlier? Well, my guess is that it was simply a time issue for Masahiro Sakurai to be able to concentrate on it. I could believe that such an upgrade could even at a push be released prior to the holiday season this year, if it's just a case of Takahashi showing Sakurai what his EPT team have done with the game and Sakurai signing it off. Because this wouldn't involve a new version of the game, this probably would obviate most of the legal issues around trying to release a game with so many third parties involved, and this will be a welcome extra fillip to Nintendo's sales pitches for Switch 2 this winter, and would clear the decks well and truly for Sakurai to start a new game in the new year. Will it receive, though, a formal Nintendo Switch 2 edition? I think the only reason not to is the fear that it would cause a delay of some months to Sakurai's next title, and also some of the budgetary issues that could be caused by all of the legal and scale complications with the game. Even if they aspired to keep their scale in check, remember that there are precedents of DLC becoming full new games, as for example Super Mario Galaxy 2 and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. All things considered, I think Nintendo has so much invested in game chat and mouse mode, while Sakurai is so keen to make his games look the best, that it feels at least 30% likely. Besides legal problems, which probably can be overcome, the only reason I'm keeping it this low is because I think they will want the next game to be released no later than mid-generation, and on that front the clock is seriously ticking. A minor benefit now in terms of people buying the upgrade patch and Nintendo being able to run promotions with Smash might come with a serious long-term downside if they get their timings wrong. Of course, the big question as a result is, what will the new Smash game be like? And vitally, when will it come? Check back for a future video, but do check out Patreon for early exclusive and ad-free content. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.